Hi, everybody. We're starting the Cinematic Migrations Symposium today, and I'm very happy to see you. This is our first session, and in a way, it's a continuation of our experiment. And so we have, I mean, there's a lot of openness in terms of learning about what we're doing. And I just wanted to welcome you all to start with, and I'm glad to see that you're here. And I'd like to give you some background information. So the symposium and the weekend of screenings mark a significant node in the launch of the Cinematic Migrations project. It's a good time to look at what was begun and what's continued to develop. When reflecting on the time period during which this project has been taking shape at MIT, I'm reminded that this work has had a long trajectory. In brief, the idea developed from life experiences as an artist in the field, observing practices emerged since the early 1980s. Initial impetuses before this project became a project were my questions regarding how it might be possible to identify and describe, from my perspective, what I and other artists I've observed and about whom I've been curious in terms of what they've made, who were born around 1960, more or less, who are working with media, specifically time-based media. How are they coming to terms with the world they entered? Beyond being labeled by popular media as something called, during the 1980s, the Generation X, for example, I was thinking about people who have been born in different parts of the world, yet who are what I've been calling combination people. By that, I mean that they are composed of combinations of cultural reference and languages and very complicated histories that don't solely refer to a unified national narrative, for example. And I began imagining all kinds of combinations as my imagination is informed by experiences of my own and the people I've known, relatives and friends everywhere I've lived. The other questions I had stemmed from the way in which time-based media has become, during my lifetime, a default for form of mental engagement or escape that has been a crucial way of perceiving the world for many people throughout the world, in intimate and in public spaces for their entire existences. I wanted to think about these things in relation to how art, culture, and technology are produced, perceived, and felt. 4 years ago in San Francisco, I was lucky enough to have convinced John Akomfrah to visit to give a talk and screening, partly linked to a public program related to my exhibition at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. It was called Endless Dreams and Time-Based Dreams, and also at the San Francisco Art Institute, where I taught. I'd been trying to arrange this for a few years. I was just saying to Greg Tate, who's here, it's been like maybe, I don't know how many years, it was like a decade. But I knew John, I had met John another time in London in the 1990s, somewhere, maybe it was the ICA, also walking on the street sometime. And so through a lot of negotiations, it was possible to be able to invite him. And this is in part because of the way that he and Lena Gopal, who I'll get to, are working together. And so, yes, as I said, I managed to arrange this visit. And his visit coincided with the volcano eruption in Iceland, which interrupted air travel to Europe. And so by another surprising coincidence, it was also possible for me to meet Lena Gopal she joined us in San Francisco because she was not able to fly out of the country. And the original plan had been that she was going to go back to London, and I think she was going to be sending some of the material that we were going to be looking at. In any case, everything got shuffled, and she was able to join. And there were two screenings that took place. One was Mnemosyne, and the other one was The Last Angel of History. And primarily, I wanted to be in conversation with both, as I'd had a sense of their work, but had not been able to have much direct access to it. And in Berlin in 1997, at a conference called Loving the Alien, I'd had a chance to watch The Last Angel of History. And I'd become fascinated by its form as well as what it more mysteriously purported, even though it also had an interesting mixture of interviews, yet it wasn't a documentary. In short, I have been interested in thinking with others who are also interested in probing and articulating in forms complexities of living, yet in compelling ways. In 1994, I organized a symposium called Negotiations in the Contact Zone. This was in New York. It was at the Drawing Center. And it relates in a way to my ongoing questions regarding trajectories and translations of various kinds. The acknowledgement of being in motion or migration, the emotions and mental stimulations that ensue, the friendships that may be possible, spanning time and different locations to be able to think and make what doesn't exist. From Black Audio Film Collective to Smoking Dogs Films, John Akomfrah, OBE, director and artist, Lena Gopal, producer, I say, and artist, both have enacted ways of thinking that I found very compelling, as the challenge is continually met to think and make what doesn't yet exist in a form, and to remember, to explore memory, histories, and stories in their complexity with what can be seen and heard. A relentless curiosity to probe these, yet in ways both fresh and deeply as well as widely informed. So there's a certain ongoingness about this project, and also about these ways of thinking. And one of the things that we've been engaged in doing, and I say we because this has been a collaborative endeavor over the past 2 years, Cinematic Migrations has been also a seminar, and as well as a lecture series. So ways of thinking with people, productions, and things. One spur to working with the seminar, Cinematic Migrations, during this residency was the book, Evocative Object, Things We Think With, and that's edited by Sherry Turkle. And it was one among different prods, and it includes stories by many people, many of whom are affiliated with MIT, about objects that have evoked ways of thinking and feeling, whether these were related to design, play, discipline, desire, history, exchange, transition, passage, mourning, memory, meditation, and new vision. And these are the categories that are stated in the book. While not taking any of these literally, there was a sympathy between our operations and Cinematic Migrations, which were given the porous framework of the broad combination of cinematic and migrations. Forms of interpretation were diverse and continue to be diverse. Desire for cinema, as is stated in the description of this project, existed before its creation. Today, cinema is an umbrella term for a variety of moving images and time-based forms, which have intersecting yet particular histories of emergence. These histories and contexts include changing technological and spatial forms themselves, from collective halls to handheld devices, in which cinema appears as well as the movement and interpretation of cinemas throughout the world. Cinematic Migrations is a multifaceted look at the role of cinema's transmutations over time and its worldwide and circuitous shifts. The theme is explored in a variety of formats, and as I said, in seminars, workshops, public lectures, and now symposium. So I'd like to mention some of the collaborators and who've participated in this and the 2-year project. So as I said, I'm very grateful and happy that it was possible to work together with John and with Lena and Smoking Dogs Films, Free Agent Media, also, that's me, and also Javier Angera. And so John's work and the work we've been looking at actually Black Audio Film Collective work as well as Smoking Dogs film work, and also thinking about being artists independently, the way that John is now going about it in terms of different projects that are taking place. And so this multi-pronged way of working is one of the impetuses of our ongoing work. And some of the people who've been guests have included Karim Anous, Arthur Jaffa, who's going to participate with us. He's here. Knut Azdam, Jazel Kapadia, who's working with us. Chip Lord, Ross Gray, Nora Alter, Charles Atlas, Lavat Codignone, Tariq El Haik, and Joan Jonas. And in this spring, Yvonne Rayner will join us, Elvan Zabunian, and Kazuo Kobata from Tokyo is coming, I believe, next week, the week after next. So we continue. And what I hope this symposium can allow are continued conversations and stimulation, encounters of different kinds, in the symposium, and also during the weekend at the Harvard Film Archive, the screenings that are going to be taking place on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And I'd like to thank, as I said, I can't thank enough, Gina, Lena, and John for participating in the experiment, and also, I mean, it's pretty huge to commit for 2 years to come across the ocean to an academic environment for a week each semester. I think it's huge. So thank you. But actually, I want that invitation to remain open. You're always welcome back. And the guests who we have here during this event, Manthia Diawara, I'm so glad that we were able to convince him to come from New York. He wrested himself away from a conference he's in the midst of, or a whole week of hosting that he's in the midst of doing with Angela Davis. So it's pretty massive that he's actually agreed to come here. So thank you for coming. Also, Laura Marks, thank you for being here. Gloria Sutton, who's also ACT affiliate, is with us as well. I'm really happy that she's here. And I'd like to thank the students from ACT very much for all of your engagement and your help, and also faculty who've been engaged. The heroic staff of ACT, you guys have given amazing support in all forms, and SAP, VAP, CAST, and all of MIT. So, just had to do that. So for friendship spanning time and different locations to think and make what doesn't exist, these are some of the the main ideas that I'd like to stress. And I'm actually going to show a clip or several clips that are co-joined from a feature film called Endless Dreams and Water Between from 2009 of mine, and it's related to the impetus to start the project. And I'm going to follow that with another short film called Come Closer, which was made in 2008, and it was a prelude to Endless Dreams and Water Between. And both of those films, I think you probably get the sense of why, I hope, I'm showing these. Yeah, I just say one thing about Endless Dreams and Water Between. It's an excerpt of this, as I said, feature-length film, and it has 4 female characters, each of whom live on islands, including Manhattan and San Francisco Bay archipelago, the archipelago, and Mallorca. So let's see those films, and thank you very much for being here.
This is the second time in a row that I have dreamt about water. 2 nights ago, I dreamt about the Mediterranean Sea and a Greek island named Pesta. The dream was related to Atlantis, the city that sunk into the ocean. Last night, I dreamt about traveling outside of one's body. I dreamt of the Bronte children dying, but not really being dead. A small boy suddenly died, but his corpse was not buried. Within a few days, it did not rot. I saw him breathing as if asleep. He opened his eyes and sat up, said he had been on a voyage beneath the sea. Many of my friends were disappearing, and I could not find them. They returned telling me that they were in another dimension beneath the sea. Several of them said that suddenly they were able to go to a place in the depths of the ocean. They were going to have a party there and asked if I would come. I wanted to know the secret of how they were able to go to this deep place. One gave me a very tiny submarine, smaller than my smallest finger, and told me to climb in. I just held it, not knowing how to use the submarine. I looked out of a window which came to the water's edge. I wondered what would happen if I were to jump in. Would I develop fins on my neck for breathing the farther I sank? Would I find this secret, buried place?
From this island area, in this state that was once perceived to be an island, how do I inhabit this place? It's been interesting to begin reading George Sand and to attempt understanding her context. Wars were quite constant in Europe before her birth and through her life. I think about that here, as this nation is still at war. The rift between the rich and the poor is wider than it was before 1981. Prison expansion as a private industry has been growing, and California is notorious for its number of prisons and number of incarcerated people. I think about these things here, as there continue to be reminders, like Alcatraz. To balance that, there is the sea and the long histories. I do experience more dreamy states of mind while reading and drifting. Wet sounds of steadily falling rain and of spinning car wheels. These are common during winter in Northern California. This was what I heard as I began reading letters written by George Sand to someone named Marcy. Writing is a bit like dreaming. Thoughts and memories swirl in and out of my mind, like a fog that I can see from a distance and watch gradually swirl in, engulf me in my surroundings, then shift again and go elsewhere. What one tries to put into words can seem dense and difficult to grasp, and like fog, it's full of tiny drops of water-like thought, sometimes feeling colder depending on its density, yet it reflects many degrees of light. I'm looking forward to continuing. I'm sure more words will come. Yours, Raya.
How to translate past feelings, times, and histories into meaningful comprehension that can provide fuel amidst present feelings of lack and absence. Was it always this way? I wonder about life before our presumed extreme technological connectivity and presumed availability. I wonder how you feel and how others have felt. Probing these things has motivated this correspondence. The wish for something else that might be possible, more profound understanding, for example, other kinds of meaning. I do care about depth and varieties of meanings as I care about combinations and permutations, as we've discussed. Autodidacticism can be extremely fulfilling, especially when so much can appear to be a wasteland. This doesn't mean that I'm interested in retreating, but rather I feel my senses available to engage are sharpened as I can choose a more exact way of articulating or conveying them in words, images, sounds, etc. I respect and admire each of you for also sharing these interests. Since so many specialized skills, things, and people are slipping into oblivion, my interest is more and more in what is specific and perhaps thought of as esoteric. What is determinedly unfashionable. This interests me. Maybe some things are too difficult to reproduce because there is no facility, concentration, or interest that enables easy reproduction. I'm not endorsing craft, as it's recently been labeled. This is not my interest. I'm also not suggesting difficulty for the sake of difficulty, nor am I assuming that specialty can be equated with superiority. Yet still, I wish to probe life's complexity. And I'm glad that each of you is also willing to do this. I'll conclude my letter with something to ponder as it relates to what I've written. We can wander with Henri Bergson and Gilles Deleuze. Why something rather than nothing? But why this rather than something else? Why this tension of duration? Why this speed rather than another? Why this proportion? And why will a perception evoke a given memory or pick up certain frequencies rather than others? In other words, being is difference and not the immovable or the undifferentiated, nor is it contradiction, which is merely false movement. Being is the difference itself of the thing, what Bergson often calls the nuance. I'll leave you with those words until the next time. From each of our islands, let's stare at the moon. Yours, Aria.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce Manthia Diawara. He's the professor of comparative literature of Africana Studies at NYU. And he is also the director of NYU's Institute of Afro-American Affairs and director of the Africana Studies program. I have this bio. I'm not sure how recent this bio is. Actually has all these kinds of things about you. But one of the reasons that I invited him is because, as I mentioned before, negotiations in the contact zone, this event that took place in 1994, he was one of the participants in that. And so I consider this to be kind of an ongoing conversation, and that some of the people who are here have different kinds of links in different ways. So I'm really curious to hear what Manthia is going to say now. We did publish this as a book. It's in Portuguese and also in English. It was published in Lisbon, Negotiations in the Contact Zone. So without too much hemming and hawing, I'm just going to invite him up and look forward to his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee. Also like to thank not only Renee, Xavier, Lucas, Madeleine, as well as John and Lena somewhere here, whose work actually brought me here, besides Renee being my friend. So yes, I want to thank you also for this very poetic vignettes that you just saw us, but also with references to, George Sand that I used to read when I was a kid. So that was nice. Thank you. My Francophone upbringing. Let me see if I can handle this. My presentation is called John Akomfrah, Cinema and the Poetics of Becoming. But I want to talk first about my preoccupations. I have two main preoccupations in the presentation. I want to address first the ways in which, and then when I say John Akomfrah Cinema, I meant the Black Audio Collective, but I also mean Smoking Dogs. I'm presenting here in terms of the author, and the way we discuss authors, but please bear in mind that it's broader than that. So I'll be saying John Akomfrah as opposed to Black Audio, so please understand me there. Okay. So two concerns. One has to do with the crisis in representation in John Akomfrah's work. And the other one, his preoccupation with the archive. These are the two concerns that I'll be addressing. Why the crisis in representation? One, because of his search for the, I guess Godard calls it the right image. What is the image to represent the subjects that he represents? Crisis in that sense, and crisis in a sense that Godard had the same preoccupation, but somebody much closer to us, Samben Usman, had that same preoccupation. He had because really we get, in talking about the images, we have several understanding of what the right images is. Some people may just go after the tone of the image, the framing of the image, the quality, or even the essence of an image. What is a black image? Some people may go after that. But somebody like Samben went after how to represent Africa after all the representation of Africa that we've had. How to represent Africa, which will be also entering in a serious discussion with the negritude movement, but also how to represent Africa in the Fanonian sense. Your image is what you create as you decolonize yourself. That becomes your image. This was Samben Usman's main concern. Of course, the reason why it's very difficult to go past Samben in African cinema is that once people realize that that kind of representation of Africa is not only an aesthetic preoccupation, but also a political preoccupation, then people have to figure out how to either get rid of Samben or get past Samben, so that the whole African cinema is really bogged down to what to do with Samben. Because he realized this crisis in representation. When we move to Suleiman Cissé, for example, he doesn't seem to have a problem with the image. He has, just make the image beautiful, make the black skin beautiful, make all these things. So he tells the story and does not seem to have, this fella's notion of arresting the music in order to create the music. He creates images. Idris Ouedraogo the same way. And I think that we did not bring up the question again until, at least in the African context, the Francophone cinema context, until Abdrahman Sissako's Bamako, where again we went away from the beautiful images or the ugly images for that matter to discussing how you represent this. This Africa that you see in front of you with its joys, sadness, everything, how do you represent it? And that really become what the image is, as opposed to looking for who understands the essence of the image. So you go away from the essence, you try to deal with the crisis which become political itself, which become aesthetic itself in black cinema. And really, I would say after Samben, the person most preoccupied with this notion of arresting cinema until you talk about the representation is John Akomfrah for me. The other preoccupation that all of you are familiar with would be how the archive is no longer a B-roll in his films, how the archive becomes the primary source of narration. So these are the issues that concern me in this presentation here, which are titled Poetics of Becoming, because I feel that it encompasses, in addition to Akomfrah's repositioning of archival images and sounds in his films, his important contribution to the SF film genre and the conversation his films initiate on such difficult topics as African modernity, African diaspora, and the subject of hyphenated identities. I will argue that such an open-ended practice defines Akomfrah's film language by locating its moments of resistance, subversion, and contradiction as moments of emergency in society, states of crisis, which for Akomfrah simultaneously constitute the emergence of the new, of the hyphen, and of that which is beyond the status quo. And I really mean by that, when we create the difference again, many times we fall in the trap of creating institutionalized differences or going after differences that are already institutionalized. Black, white, male, woman, and so on. But how you break out of those bureaucratic differences would be very important in his films. The term of poetics of becoming sums up for me what I believe to be a more appropriate characterization of Akomfrah's art of conceptual, political, and theoretical cinema, of a cinema that moves away from a simple representation of politics in its narratives in order to politicize the image and its positioning in the film. Again, I, I'm really impressed by the fact that he's not necessarily trying to look for the real image. The right image and the real image are really, at least in Godard, are very different. That is, Akomfrah cinema constantly questions the one-to-one relation between image and reality, subverts the stable meaning of archival contents, and reconstitute alternative narratives with found objects and sounds instead of searching for the essence of the image. He posits its arbitrariness in order to put it in relation with other images that are different. It is for all those reasons that I consider Akomfrah cinema as a poetic of becoming, to borrow a concept from Edouard Glissant. In his book, Philosophie de la Relation, Glissant considered two opposing definitions of the known. The French is le verbe être, the verb être, but also the being is l'être. So he said that there are two ways of, which I'm translating here as being, but there are two ways of conceptualizing this. First, there is the being that we legitimize as singular, unified, and unique creature, the I in linguistics, for example, which is self-referential and identical to itself. This identitarian being is also the national being, the nationalist being. We, us, are different from the other people. So there is that kind of being in search of the authentic self. There is that being. And then, on the other hand, there is another conception of being, which Glissant calls être comme étant, and this is where I got the title from. Être comme étant, it is to be as becoming, be as becoming, as opposed to this other being that is, fixed in a way. That describes the subject in the process of becoming, always in movement, and prone to mixing and fusing with other being, also in movement. For Glissant, the human cannot stop moving or changing. She is always in the making, which does not mean losing itself or assimilating in the culture of the other. And Glissant has a whole concept about this, where he says, I can change by exchanging myself with the other without losing myself or destructing myself. Because I think one of our biggest fears is that if we interchange with the other, we will be polluted, we will be contaminated, we will be unauthentic. But Glissant says you don't lose any of that. Actually, you're getting part of that, the others, what makes the other rich. You're getting some of that, and you're also giving some of what you are rich in. Akomfrah cinema to define the identities of his characters through the mobility and errantry about the world. The space in Akomfrah's films is a fertile ground for relation between emerging identities, sites where encounters take place in conflict, crisis, or indifference, and give birth to new social forms of life. By creating confluences and contradiction between sound and images in his films, he initiates new ways of discovering the other that is no longer transparent and assimilated to the same, or opposed to or against the self, but an other acknowledged through difference in equality. I'm not going to read throughout, so I just want to ground a little bit what I'm trying to do here, then I'll talk to you, so please bear with me. Akomfrah cinema is a poetic of becoming because of the author's insistence on revealing the arbitrariness of the relation between image and sound. And you really have to appreciate this when you are from certain areas and the ways in which your images are stored in big museums and archives, and they are fixed there with meanings. When you have somebody who comes and bring up the arbitrariness of these images, it's like liberating you all of a sudden, in a way, because if you go to British Museum, the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, or any of these museums, Germany, you see images of Africa archived, fixed. If you want to know something, you go to this. There is a Leo Frobenius files, somewhere in Berlin, or Rivette or Marcel Griot files in Paris, and British Museum, God knows what is there. So this arbitrariness becomes quite important in his work and the way he deals with that. In Akomfrah's film, we see a process of textualization in discontinuity with characters who are tentative, self-doubting, and always caught in between events that transcend them and generate new patterns of culture. And I'm really thinking about Mnemosyne. I always say it in French and don't know how to later on. Mnemosyne. So listening to her today, I said Mnemosyne, as the English said, but it always gives me problems anyway. But I got this concept from that film where you see people just wandering around, and I'll talk more about that film later on, 9 Muses at least. We also have at times philosophical meditation on history with capital H and an undermining of this same concept by bringing it on equal footing with other narrative forms such as the essay, the poem, the epic, the first-person narratives. And I really enjoyed your first-person narratives in this film and how they fix in this epistolary manner. Yeah, that was really refreshing. At any given time, the viewer is challenged to read the films as a continuous process of his or her own beings. I always read myself into Akomfrah's films in that sense. As interrupted histories of encounters, conflicts, and rebirth, as ways of being in the world, with identities changing all the time as they enter in relation with other identities. Now, I get to my central point here, which is the Stewart Hall Project. When I watched this film, I kept seeing different works of Akomfrah in this one film, which is solely made out of archival material. But you can see the preoccupation. I mean, three of my most important Akomfrah films, and I will say again, because today, the film that I cited are Last Angel of History and so on. So he has several, but the 3 that really interpellate me would be Handsworth and then 9 Muses, but especially Testament. These are the 3 films that I see my own trajectory in these films. And what I'm going to try to do is talk to you first about the Stewart Hall Project and see how these 3 films are coming out of the Stewart Hall Project, or vice versa. The Stewart Hall Project is coming out of these 3 films. So this is important to me. What is remarkable about this film, first of all, is that we see, and this is really incredible, Akomfrah, Black Smoking Dogs, they go to archives to make a film called the Stewart Hall Project. This is, if you don't know anything about the project, this is what you assume. But they make this film only without, with archives. With archives put in a very intelligent false teleology, beginning, middle, and end. You see that? And also manipulate the viewer in this sense to think that, okay, Miles Davis's music is structuring the film. okay, the first person narrative is structuring the film, and meanwhile you say, okay, I'm really seeing a biography of Stuart Hall here. Because you see Stuart Hall speaking first narrative, he will say, my sister did this, as if he was answering a question put by John Akomfrah. Or he would say, when I was this place, I was too black, too ta-ta-ta-ta. So you see him doing these things, and you think, as a film viewer, which is a normal relation to the film, that this is a biography. It's because he brings, as by magic, the character Stuart Hall into presence by using Stuart Hall's, well, all kind of archives, but especially Stuart Hall's Open University lectures and documentaries. Take them and make a biography or a false biography, a simulacrum, if you want, out of that. So that part, I think, is very interesting. And ironically, with the passing of Stuart Hall, this film is going to be the biography of Stuart Hall. I find that very fascinating also. But the preoccupation in the film, for me, goes beyond that. It goes beyond that. What is remarkable is the way Akomfrah creates a real effect and magically makes a presence out of absence by producing the simulacrum of a seamless biography of Hall. And he goes, when you look at the film, he cuts it in. I think you can just look at Miles Davis and let Miles Davis hold you by the hand if you want. But when you also look at the film, it has chapter headings, subheadings, like chapter 1, chapter 2, and so on, which will have ideas like from the colony to the post-colony, Freedom Road, the specter of difference, new voices, and so on. Very important, the coming of cultural studies, the creation of the New Left Review. So he's actually giving a sociological narrative of Britain from the 50s to the present. So the film is giving this sociological narrative, political, aesthetic, and Stuart Hall's role in that as a public intellectual. So I think the viewer is probably justified in thinking that this is a biography, in many ways. What I will do is just show you a clip of that if Madeleine is ready to show a clip of toward the beginning. I want to show you how he used his first-person narrative, even though he was not interviewed by at least these filmmakers. Okay, let me start talking. Whilst he's searching for the clip, one of the things that I'm going to be doing is to describe this film a little bit, fairly literally, in order to begin to apply what is happening in this film to, oh, great.
part English, part African, part Portuguese Jew, even some say a little East Indian.
Now this one is the...
My Aunt Jerry was a teacher then, and incredibly, she's still a teacher today. I felt this tension throughout my life between what I thought I was, a young, bright Jamaican, and this refusal of my family really to live in that world at all. In Jamaica, the question of exactly what shade you were in colonial Jamaica, that was the most important question, because you could read off class and education and status from that. I was aware and conscious of that from the very beginning. We're accustomed to think about the cultures as still very rooted in
the intimate images and the voice that's very personal. That seems like Stuart is responding to a documentary filmmaker's questions about his life, very moving in that sense. The film is illuminating for more than one reason. It seems to me that Akomfrah's genius lies in what he has done with archives that no filmmaker before him, since Chris Marker and Alain René in the statue also died, the statue also has been able to accomplish with such a masterful tour de force. He has succeeded in creating an effect of realism, linearity, and authenticity by deterritorializing and reassembling arbitrary and disjointed archives. The Stuart Hall project is illuminating, though, for more than one reason. It not only manifests by the magic of cinema the presence of Hall and familiarizes us with this social biography, politics, and intimate life, it is also a grammar book for introducing the viewer to Akomfrah's own evolution and film language. For even though many of us claim Hall as a source of inspiration and influence in cultural studies, and claim as his statement that race is the lens through which class relations are inflected, John Akomfrah may yet be Hall's best student in the sense that his cinema takes in all the themes that were clear, that were dear to the heart of the guru of cultural studies, and pushes them to the limits in fields and domains unexpected by Hall himself. Because I'm sure Stuart Hall probably was either very surprised by this film or thoroughly embarrassed. I don't know which one, So, because a film was created where there was no film in a way. So, while many of Hall's followers only mastered one or two of his ideas, let's say Englishness in the era of Thatcherism, or the anti-American capitalism and anti-essentialism, one can think of Gilroy and Isaac Julian here. Akomfrah's work follows Hall from the beginning to end, his preoccupation with the movement of decolonization. And this move toward the Caribbean and Africa is very important to me. This is one of the reasons Testament is one of my favorite films. That cultural studies both in the United States and Britain just gave up. Black American do Black American cultural studies, African do African cultural studies, Black British do Black British cultural studies. So there is no connection whatsoever, whereas these were some of the most important preoccupations for Stuart Hall himself. So decolonization, so his preoccupation with the movement of decolonization, migration to England, and coming to terms with racism, the turn away from deterministic Marxism and toward cultural studies, an analysis of multiculturalism through new voices and new times, feminism and sexual politics. The film follows him through that, and this is also a major preoccupation for Akomfrah. In Akomfrah's work, as in Hall's, the question becomes how to represent that which has not been represented before. And I think Renee's earlier introduction talked about this when she talks about combination people exploring what does not yet exist. I think he talked about this at some point. How to find the emergent in the moment of crisis and emergency. What languages to use and when to recognize where such methodological languages are worn out. This is really important in Akomfrah's work, and it is really lacking in our own work in many ways, where we just stick to one idea and we don't change. You know, I can think of how long the Black Atlantic concept has been around, and we're still not letting it go. But no wonder then, from the beginning of Akomfrah's career, he was attacked by Rushdie on this very question of representation. I'm here referring to the infamous polemics that opposed Salman Rushdie to Black Audio Film Collective after Handsworth's songs. And who else will come to Akomfrah's defense but Stuart Hall? So this is quite fascinating when you talk about the representation, because Rushdie was very disturbed by the language of representation used in Handsworth's songs, and Stuart came to the defense of Handsworth's song. I think you can see many of these polemics and letters and responses in, I think it's in ICA documents. And it's also interesting here that even still today, you know, if you look at essays by people like Gilroy, The Cruciality of the Frog, that they have this problem of Akomfrah's representation, because he's trying to figure out a language for representation, and they have already settled in a language, in not only a representative language, but an institutionalized language of representation. And the same thing happened in Black America and so on, where they say it's the Black thing, how do you represent it? And from this concept, other people don't understand it. Only Black people understand it. And the Black British, Paul Gilroy will say, if you're not born in London, you really do not understand it. You have to be, you know, Englishness is something that is, that's not easily acquired in a way. The Stuart Hall project, insofar as it is a simulacrum, cinerealism, and a cinerealism, I think one could link this to people like Fred Jamieson, or even to Baudrillard, not only of Hall's biography, but also of a mise en practice of his cultural and sociological theories, also provide an excellent grid for rereading Akomfrah's own preoccupation with film language, the politics of the images, and his emergence as a major figure of the African diaspora, which are called here his poetics of becoming. We have in the Stuart Hall project two forms of interpretation, two forms of interpellation. Hall and Akomfrah calling one another into being, because Akomfrah has followed Hall's work in order to, in his processes of creating his own film language. But Akomfrah too called Hall into being, explaining Hall to Hall. This is why I said it's either embarrassing or very surprising when he saw the film. A flirtation turned into a poetics of relation between the two men. one reflecting the other's image through rhizomes of ideas that become the embodiment of a person, with multiple trips and detours in the West Indies, Europe, America, and Africa, what Glissant called le tout monde in many ways. Thus, the body of Akomfrah's work has become an important key to understanding not only the person of Stuart Hall, but more importantly, what his intellectual endeavors stood for, what he struggled for, what he achieved. Similarly, one can say that the film, The Stuart Hall Project, also reveals a lot about Akomfrah's life and work. My argument here is that understanding Hall is a road that passes through Akomfrah's films, which also lead back to the writing and filmed archives of Stuart Hall. And then I want to turn now to the three specific films that I talked about, and because I'm sure you want some time for discussion, so let me, okay, good, all right. Alors, I have a close reading of Testament, but before I get to that, let me talk about my other two films that are of significance to me here. First, I think that if you look at the Stuart Hall project, what become very interesting is that Akomfrah is bringing back many of the central themes by looking at Stuart Hall's life in the 70s and 80s, 90s in England, in London. Akomfrah is actually able to make the audience understand some of the themes that he had already approached in a film like Handsworth Songs. In the themes in the Stuart Hall projects, like the chapter heading is called Minimal Selves, Multiple Identities, Black Britishness, and so on, they come very strongly in Handsworth Songs. But more importantly, for me at least, Handsworth Songs is able to do something that the Stuart Hall project talks about, but also if you listen to John Akomfrah's own lectures and projection, he talks about a lot too, is the whole idea of hyphenated subjects or identities, the idea of the hyphen, which become very important. Hyphen in French is called trait d'union, the line that unites. That's what the hyphen is called in French. And Glissant also has worked a lot on the concept of hyphen in his book called Poetics of Relation. And what is fascinating about Glissant's take on the hyphen that we see in Handsworth Songs is that Glissant looks at hyphens by looking at the line that united two words in French, what he called lieu commun. You know, lieu commun, like common ground, basically. That's the definition of lieu commun. So if you say in French language, or this is a lieu commun, or what you are really saying to the person is that, this is banal. You know, it's uninteresting. We know this is common sense or something like that. There is that kind of lieu commun. But when you write lieu commun, common ground with a hyphen, you bring them together, then for Glissant, you are actually bringing two thoughts together, or two people together, or two identities together. And the richness that you get by just having African American, Black British, or you are also bringing struggles together. Let's say if you have one kind of struggle in the United States, how that struggle inspires another struggle in UK, in Africa, and how these movements, I mean, Stuart Hall's whole concept behind New Left Review was that, how to talk about, you know, and I mentioned this in Testament, but how the events in the Suez Canal, the events in Yugoslavia, in Burma, will inspire events in London, in other places. So the lieu commun, the common, the hyphen between these things was very important to Stuart Hall, and that's what becomes apparent in Handsworth's songs when we have links between one thought from one part of the world to another thought on another part of the world. Create and connect the resistance forms of one place to that of another. Posit difference as a conversation between equals about the coming of an alternative world against institutionalized and bureaucratic forms. And in this case, the other question is also very important. What the clip I want to show you is in Handsworth's songs when Malcolm X visits, as an example of lieu commun. You know, it's Malcolm X's visit to England and how that is connoting the current situation in England, even though it represented another time in the United States. And today, Malcolm X becomes really relevant. His popularity is growing more and more in France because it is needed more in France than almost in the United States and in UK. So let me just show you that clip if Madeleine is ready. And I also want to thank Lena here for helping me with these clips, you know, because I had to look for them. I was just going to talk to you, but thank you.
Just don't have that kind of
Bit about nine muses or nemusin, and then we can come back to this, and then I go to Testament, because it seems to me that I'll tell you why I like that film. After rewatching the Stuart Hall project, there is a chapter about freedom, and Stuart talks about going to America, I think in the 50s. He goes to America, and what does he take with him? He takes the Odyssey and Ulysses, you know, 2 books, because he really didn't want to be recognized by anybody. He wanted to be wandering, basically. He wanted to be wandering. He wanted to be doing what Gleason calls errantry, you know, nomadism, basically. He wanted to walk. And that really does not become seriously, poetically important to one until you see, you know, I read it in Gleason, I was fascinated, but when you see a 9 muses where the wanderer actually does not reach a destination. Can you imagine in the Odyssey, he comes back, because it's the epic. The epic form is such that the epic hero, whether it is Samson the Roland or Beowulf or any of these heroes, they come back and they build a nation. This is the whole thing about the epic. In many ways, the immigrants leave the Caribbean, they come to London, and they think about returning home. If you look at the biggest epic in Africa, the Epic of Sunjata, it's again about departure and return. You know, you have departure, middle with its obstacles, and then you return and you build a nation. Now, first, this takes me to Glissant. Glissant's argument is, and he borrows a lot from Deleuze in this concept. His argument is, suppose the hero never, suppose Ulysses had now returned. So imagine the Greek tradition if Ulysses had now returned. And then imagine all the nationalist movements in Africa. Suppose for Mali, mundane people, Sunjata had now returned. He went to exile, learned how to fight, did all these things, and he returned to build Mali. But suppose he had built a home every place he arrived to. Suppose he had built a home. Okay, I will interrupt. We show the segment, and we come back. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Afro-Caribbean meeting places, and all they ever found in these places was small quantities in possession of people of cannabis, no hard drugs. The only hard drugs that police have busted in the last few months have been Asian businessmen who were pushing heroin and things like that. I mean, it's obvious, you know, you can't have Rastas sort of flying over to India and Pakistan collecting heroin. You know, Afro-Caribbean and unemployed Asian youth just don't have that kind of money to push those type of hard drugs. Those hard drugs are being brought in by organized criminal businessmen.
On the 10th of September 1985, a journalist is pestering a middle-aged black woman on the Lozelles Road. He wants her opinion on the disturbances. Did she have a relative involved? Could he talk to one of them? He is writing a story. She looks at the debris and says to him calmly, "There are no stories in the riots, only the ghosts of other stories. If you look there, you can see Enoch Powell telling us in 1969 that we don't belong. You can see Malcolm X visiting us in 1965 when the Conservatives said, 'If you want a nigger for your neighbour, vote Labour.' She remembered Malcolm strolling through Smethwick saying, 'If this is the centre of imperialism, then we have a common struggle.' For a moment, the voice of Malcolm swooned over the ashes of decline.
Has been created between the resistance against policing in UK, just as in the United States. That's basically what I wanted to show there. And to come to Nine Muses, I had already started, and I was at the Epic. The argument for people who talk about nomadism or errantry, nomadology, whether it is Deleuze or Glissant, their main argument is that if the epic hero returns, then we have nationalism. You know, but not only you have nationalism, but you also have filiation. You know, filiation, your identity is created by, you know, your progenitors, you know, your son of son of son, so you get authenticity. A true French person, you know, is a person who did not come from another country to take nationality in France. A true British person is a person who lives in Englishness and Britishness in a way, who knows how to do that. In fact, there was a moment when they were talking about nationalism in France, right before Sarkozy left the office, they were talking about your nationality decaying. If your nationality decays, la déchéance de la nationalité, then you can lose it. That is, people who do not respect Frenchness can lose their nationality, even though they already have acquired a French nationality. So you see, the epic form leads to that. And then there is another form where the epic hero is always wandering and accruing more and more identities, creating cities in different places and moving on to other places and creating cities. And the return anxiety is really not there. So, and Gleason calls that the identity through relation, how you create your identities through relation. And I really thought that was a powerfully illuminated in 9 Muses. When I saw that, first, I saw them in this white snow walking, and they keep going. You see boats, and you have a sense that they're going to arrive at some destination. And they keep going. And you can see it in Nemosin also. You can see it. And it's just an amazing moment in that film. Now, I turn to because I think I want to save some time for discussion. I turn to Testament, which for me, this is the cinema, the beginning really of films, politics, literature, about nation building, about decolonization and nation building, and what happens to that later on. That's what Testament is really about. It's a quintessential film which opens with the interrogation of what happens when 2 bodies into one are separated. The story of the film, it's got several stories, but it's basically the main character, Abina, who was in Ghana, and after the 1966 coup had to leave the country. And then she comes back later to Ghana as a journalist to cover Werner Herzog's film, the making of the Werner Herzog's film, Cobra Verde, I think the title is. And so she sees exactly one of the concerns of John Akomfrah again, because by trying to make that film, Herzog is going after the stable stereotypes. So he wants to recreate this, natural, savage Africa with the castles. So Abina, the main character, want to film or interview Herzog on this in order to question the archives in many ways. And I think it's a very important moment when your stereotype is being thrown back at you. And one of the points that I say here is that the concept of theory is actually the same as the concept of stereotype, because they all have the power to define you and fix you in that definition. You can't get out of it. So in fact, there is a great African novel called Bound to Violence by Yambo Wologem, and there is a point in the novel where you see African slaves chained, they're passing. He calls it theories of Africans. So theory in that sense, and theory and stereotype are more or less the same in terms of meaning. So Abina suddenly began to mix the personal and the public, the political in many ways. She began to question her own return. Can she return to Ghana after all these years? And what is her relation? She's one of the 2 bodies that the film is talking about. The film talks about her and Danso. Can these 2 bodies be repaired? And for a person, my generation of Africans, born in the 50s and euphoria of independence and suddenly the coup d'etats arriving, and the nostalgia about these coup d'etats. I think it's probably the best film to really question these things and their thematization. It's really an amazing moment in this film because they look at books that were burned during the coup d'etat. They open graves. They look at, Akomfrah is even able to use dreams as archives and nightmares as archives as they recur, and how you reanalyze them, how you repair the relation between these two bodies. When you separate them, does one die or not? What happens? And it's really, again, it becomes a kind of biography of African independences and decolonization for me. As the characters Abina and Danso in search for an answer to this question, oral and written archives are re-examined, graves are opened, and ruins and monuments are all questioned. When two bodies into one are separated, perhaps one dies. How much memory the survivor keeps of the dead, how to properly mourn the deceased, to pay one's obligation to the dead. Can one be forgiven by the gods of the river after one had betrayed the other? Thus, Akomfrah proposes a poetics of mourning as a cinematic style of appeasing the ghost of the betrayed ones and the gods. He showed memory as the return of the repressed. For Akomfrah, the questioning of archives, and these archives really include oral traditions, dances, performances, because again, he really enlarged the definition of the archive to include African oral traditions, but also dreams and nightmares as part of the archive. And he questioned this as a way of addressing the crisis of representation. It concerned a search for a language to represent the failure of decolonization movements, a language to represent the post-colonial condition of the relation between the two main characters, Danso and Abina, a language that could address the relation between the private and the public stories, the ghost of stories about independence, which become in Hansworth's songs, ghost stories, but I prefer to use the word the ghost of stories. The film reveals the difficulties of returning home, the betrayal of ideologies. Abina comes back to Ghana to cover the production of Herzog, and I explained that a while ago. Let me show you that clip. If it's ready, I will show you the clip of this concept that's profound in the film of the two bodies. Yeah. Give you some time. Okay, no problem, no problem. Yeah. It is, for me, what makes this important, I tell you right away, because it's not possibly, because the Africans did not, the reception of this film was not what I thought it would be in Africa. And in the West, people are understandably more attracted to Hansworth songs because it is about their lives. It's about these hyphenated subjects, as I said. It is about policing. It is about militarization in the city. And it's also about the youth, the collective youth, not only Black Audio, but also Chedo and Sankofa, trying to seize the means of representation. Whereas, if you're ready, I'll come back to this, but good, let's do that first. also the whole metaphor in Africa. Is the metaphor at the time of decolonization, I think after Bandung, after the 1956 conference of the Black writers in Paris, the biggest issue was, again, how to represent. And people like Fanon, people like Césaire, they believe that, Césaire made this very famous statement. He said, there is no culture but national culture. In other words, forget about negritude, forget about your black culture, just decolonize yourself, and as you decolonize yourself, you leave behind cultural patterns, and that's what your culture is. There is no such thing as the black man is like this, the black man is like that. This was the biggest statement by Fanon and Aimé Césaire at the 1956 conference. And of course, right after the independence, people like Nkrumah, people like Sékou Touré, and many of the African leaders who were coming from this whole idea, first started by Lenin about cultural revolution, which literally translated first as massive literacy programs, let's educate everybody, like you saw in China. But it also later became, cultural revolution become the creation of nation states which will create new cultures, the concept of the new man. This was very important. But the result of it is that in Ghana, they banned chiefs. In Mali, the chiefs, the religion, the caste systems, many of these things were banned. In fact, Richard Wright is famous for advising Kwame Nkrumah to go more in that direction. His expression was to militarize the body, basically. So when you look at that situation, and then you look at this film, which is trying to reimagine those moments in African independences, how do we create our cultures? Because the God of the river is very important in this film. So spirituality, the myth, some forms of negritude are coming back. Performance, oral tradition, they're coming back because the argument is that the betrayal was not just between two characters or two politicians, but the betrayal was also between modernity and tradition. So how you go from, there is a Gam mourners in the film. They dance and they sing about gods coming to punish people for their behaviors. So the film has a way of re-thematizing all these African histories, and I really think that this film has to come back in terms of African cinema because, as I was saying in the opening with Samben Usman questioning the representation of African images in films like Black Girl, in films like The Money Order, and so on. This film, too, is about such questions. It's about such questions, and the Stuart Hall Project really helped me to go back to the film and look at it in light of the materialist definitions of what an image is and the mythological definitions of what the image is, and how Akomfrah is trying to take all this together. But I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much. Yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Merci. So, Renee, what do we do? I'd be happy to, yes. Yeah. Questions? Yeah. AJ.
Hey, so I want to ask you a specific question, and maybe John might need to pipe. I don't know, did he disappear? He might need to pipe in as well. And I'm wondering, because also I love Testament as well. I was from the beginning. I actually remember looking at Testament before we shot Daughters, actually. I had gotten a, somehow I gotten a copy of it and saw it and looked at it several times. But I guess I'm kind of interested in if you could make a distinction, and it may just be a semantic distinction between evoking the black subject versus embodying the black subject. And I'm wondering this in the sense that John we asked John at one point something that he might have to answer again. It's like this whole question of how to situate in terms of the progress or the development or evolution of black cinema, the whole question of narrative cinema.
Narrative cinema.
Narrative cinema.
Right.
Like in the sense that I would suggest, and maybe this is a bad suggestion, but I would suggest that one of the reasons that Hansworth and the larger majority of John's work has a certain effect is because it is evoking the black subject versus Testament, which is in a sense embodying the black subject, or vice versa. In other words, one is dramatizing characters preoccupied with these notions, and the other is doing something else.
Okay.
It's a disembodied sort of investigation
Right,
of
right,
these.
right.
I'm wondering if you could
Yeah,
just
I
say
mean,
some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you actually for explaining it, because I didn't know what you meant. So you creating in a way a distinction between on the one hand narrative and non-narrative, on the other hand embodiment of the black subject, which you said is couched into narratives, and then invoking. Okay, let me see how I can approach this, because for me, and again, I'm coming really from a tradition of Fanon reread by Glissant. And both Fanon and Glissant probably will say that there is no such thing as black subject. They both will say that. They both will say that, because I remember I made, I don't know if you were here, I made the statement that I used from Fanon and Césaire, who said that there is no culture but national culture. So by doing that, they're sweeping out all the blackness, and they're saying it's only through your struggle for liberation, independence, freedom from slavery that you are creating a culture. This does not mean that you don't have other patterns of culture left behind, but which also were created through struggles and encounters. So if there is a black culture at all, it'll be the black cultures created through struggles. And I'm not really talking about essentialism here or anti-essentialism. I'm not talking about this at all. I'm talking about materialism in a way, a kind of materialist approach, that the cultures are created and the patterns are left behind through people's encounter first with nature, with each other, and so on. So this is what the Fanon and the Césaire were talking about at this conference. And therefore the culture become, then when Glissant reads them, Glissant brings myth back, like we saw myth in Testament. You see myth coming back. And Glissant will not necessarily, Glissant will say again, what do you call it, invoking? Glissant will call it traces of black culture. And he will also say it doesn't matter whether you remember it, you have a memory of it, or you've forgotten, but it's that these traces will reemerge with your work. And the idea is not to ignore them. So my best way of, I have to be honest with you, I'm glad you explained it to me, because I did not know what you meant. But my instant reaction would be that the problem is not the opposition of the narratives, that the problem is how you can do great narrative and still question. I mean, Black Girl is a narrative, but yet Black Girl is questioning the representation of Africa throughout. You see, that's the way I would see that. So it's not, to me, Tukibuki is great, but Tukibuki is not questioning the narrative for me. It's an avant-garde film. It is fun. 12 Years a Slave, I didn't want to go there, but I go there. It's a great film, but it's not questioning the image. So you see what I mean? So it's not a question about narrative or non-narrative for me. But John, as a filmmaker, I'm sure he's in that debate, and you too, as an artist, you are in that debate. But to me, I think it's how you question the image through the medium that you are using. That's what's important to me. Yeah, I don't know if I answered the question or not. Yeah.
I'm not trying to.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I said subject for lack of a better term, but we could take culture. It doesn't matter. I guess we asked John at one point, just straightforward, it was like, should we just let go of narrative filmmaking
Right.
as a viable
Right.
mean to explore these issues? Is this non-narrative thing
Right.
more what the space that black cinema is going to manifest itself
Right.
in? And if that's true, which is just maybe in a sense a straightforward question, but I'm curious how a lot of the issues that you're talking about, which everything you're saying, I sort of agree, but I'm curious if there is some inherent in the particular nature of a hyphenated subject or a hyphenated culture, a hyphenated identity, or whatever you want to say. If there's something inherent in that notion of hyphenation that lends itself to like more of an essay film or archival film or a documentary film than a narrative treatment of that same. Because it seems to me like Testament is a narrative treatment of many of those ideas versus a more kind of, straight from the brain, skull treatment or exploration of ideas.
I think you're probably right. I think you're most likely right in a sense that narrative sometimes traps us into conventions where we find functions, and these functions, let's say somebody looks this way, so we have to show what the person is looking at. So, and then by doing that, we are actually reproducing some stereotypes. So I will have no problem agreeing with you there. I think what is crucial, though, in non-narrative films is for people to be able to also bear in mind, I think John says this a lot. It's not about the politics, it's not about identity politics, but it's about politics of identity. So you're questioning every image. But non-narratives do not do that necessarily. That's why I brought up Bamako. When you look at Bamako, I think the reason why Bamako works is because the filmmaker gave up. He just left the camera there, and therefore forces you to really look at this crisis of representation. I think that's why Bamako works. I mean, I resisted it for a long time because the argument about structural adjustment, we know it. Lots of people have written about it. But when the film gave up on narrative, on framing, on functions of narrative, that's when it begins to work. Just leaving the camera there. Yeah. So I agree with you, but I'm resisting, as you can see, AJ, to the distinction between narrative and non-narrative. But your primary concept and the trapping into that, I completely agree with you. Yeah. Question? Carol? I thought, yeah.
Like your, I'm very stimulated by your suggestion that the questioning of the image stops with Semben and begins again with John Akomfrah and Black Audio.
You have few accidents every once in a while. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And I think you've answered this with your concept of becoming, but I'd like to draw you out on it some more, because I think in Semben the image is so dialectical.
Yeah.
And within every frame,
yeah,
you see the elements of the dialectic just ready to. Do you think it's that in John Akomfrah's Black Audio's work it is dialectic, or trialectic or something else going on?
Yeah. No, for me, it's more rhizomatic. It's more, it's discontinuous at that, and it doesn't have thesis, antithesis-ness. In fact, I think it stays away from that. Whereas Samben, you see, Samben came as the beginning of a certain kind of African cinema, what we call African cinema. And therefore, he also was very interested in saying, this is not an African image, this is an African image. Europe is now my center. I take all my cues from my own local, and I use my local to universalize my culture. So Samben, in that sense, and especially toward the end of his life, his films become dialectical for me. But there is the same opposition in Black Girl, too, I think, in some sense. No, I don't think the films that I like are not like that. In fact, if you look at Testament again, I think the richness of that film has to do with the way the character's neurosis is put on the screen, and then they come and question themselves. And the narratives, the dreams become archives. Even the nightmares are something that Africans need to explore as part of their archives. So it's no longer thesis, antithesis in that sense. But I think that's an interesting question. In many ways, it has, I think with Akomfrah, and I saw this in Gleason too, I think they're talking about this return that is rewarded, if return at all. You know, if you return at all, the return is rewarded with multiplicities, with multiple identity positions. Yeah. So in that sense, no, I don't think that. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe somebody else can address this question of dialectics, but I wasn't even thinking about you can see Samben without thinking that way. Yeah. No, you're just fixing your glasses, right?
Thank you, Manthia, for that presentation. Was very stimulating, and given that I'm sort of multitasking here, I'm taking it in at the same time as taking notes, thinking about it, as well as thinking about all that we've been talking about. And we were talking about some of these things last night, actually, with you and amongst ourselves. And so I guess one of the things that I found interesting in this presentation, because I feel as if I'm thinking, I was sort of like following your thoughts as you're going through them, and also some of these films also are more recent, like the Stuart Hall Project and even Nine Muses. And so in terms of trying to have any kind of a theory for any of them, it's not possible yet, in my view, but I was really interested in what you were putting together, because it's sort of opening up a way of perceiving this idea of no return.
Right.
And I'm intrigued by that, especially in relation to the epic and the kind of more traditional epic form. And so the question of what if there is no return, and you mentioned the errancy, you know, that idea, and I'm thinking about the way in which these ideas of nomadism have been applied, and I mean, I had them applied even to the work that I've been producing, and we were talking a little bit also about this kind of movement aspect, because I think it's very important, and I think that there's more there to look into in terms of how that is taking place, and so that in a way, it brings me back to thinking about these contact zone, negotiation in the contact zone questions also. Because I still don't think these things are settled. I think that these migrations and this contact zone and this movement to some sort of, I find it somehow linked to this combination that you were mentioning. And I don't have any like statement to make about this, but I think I'm finding it interesting for thinking with that.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. When you look at Nine Muses, I think, well, first when you look at the Stuart Hall project, as I said, I was so impressed when they had this moment where Hall says, "I went to America and I only took Ulysses and the Odyssey with me," and he wanted to be free in this wandering, this errantry. You read Paradise Lost, which I know John uses in his work, or the Odyssey, or Ulysses also in the films. The Paradise Lost, Milton, I'm not a specialist of this at all, but it's known as an anti-epic. And if you go to Glissant, he says, suppose the Ulysses never returned. And that's exactly what you see in Nine Muses. Because the cultures that you create in your errantry are sometimes more important than the cultures that you create as a nation. In terms of nationalism, this is our land, this is my father through filiation, but through relation, the cultures, when you see those guys walking in the snow with the blue, I think, and the yellow jacket and so on, and the places that they stop, that's more hunting in terms of the poetry. It's more hunting and it's more provocative, and it becomes a form of contemporary cultural formation, formation of identities, are new realities in many ways. The errantry becomes that.
No, it's interesting also to think about it in terms of the most, we just saw on Monday night also, in this room, a two-screen projection of a really recent work. It was a premiere, and of John's, and just thinking about how that also functioned. Because
what was that one called?
This is, I can't say the title in German. Verklagte Nacht.
Okay.
So, the Transfigured Night. Transfigured
Okay.
Night.
Uh-huh.
And so, I'm doing too many
I thought you
things at the
spent
same
a lot of
time. Just focus on that. Anyway, I'm thinking about the images that we saw, because part of that work it sort of gives you the images of the nation at the moment of that time, in the beginning of the 1960s, and also, but it also is engaged in breaking that.
Yeah.
Or that's what is that's part of what's transfigured.
Right.
But I think that, this kind of idea of like what it is that you would be, I'm very intrigued by this idea that the nation, and I'm thinking about it in generational terms as well, because it kind of comes back to my initial, my opening remarks that had to do with thinking about people born in 1960 or born around the times, the late 50s, right at the beginning of the independence movements that were taking place in Africa, and we could expand that to India as well. And so what kinds, in terms of the hopes and the ambitions, and then this wandering, the lack of the epic completion, maybe.
Right.
I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that part.
Yeah, again, this is why I'm interested, if we go back to Testament, this is why I'm interested in Testament. And actually what is happening, Abina's return in a way, even though she questions it, she still wants to recover that nation. there is a national narrative in a way in Abina's return, and this is still, we have it in soccer in Africa when Ghana plays Ivory Coast. It is also there, even when today, literally today, and I've written a little bit about this, we have nations that are no longer viable. So, and I'm very conflicted about this. My desire to destroy or undo Malian nation, is it another form of nationalism? Is this another, because I want a bigger entity? Is that what it is? Or is it because I've gone beyond nationalism, which is really, because I'm very frustrated when I see that Mali, Senegal, all the way to Ghana, they are not viable. They are not. It's just not viable. But okay. So is it because a nation is not viable that we cannot be nationalist? So I'm conflicted about this myself in many ways. And this is my return to Glissa in a way, where I'm looking at the nation in that sense. What do we do today? Where are we? But John has a point about this. So let's, John, what to? Yeah.
I want to say this because I want him to factor this into what he said before. And this is somewhat belaboring the same question I asked, but as you were talking about it,
right,
I was thinking some other things. I'm not sure if it's a split between poetry and prose that I'm trying to get at.
Right.
We know in terms of literature, poetry and prose versus prose, it's a matter of address. Mm-hmm. But in terms of cinema, it's more than a matter of address. It's a matter of economics to a certain degree. But when you talk about this crisis around, with regard to the notion of nation, I kind of feel like in my head there's some relationship between that and the crisis around the body itself, and what we do with the body in cinematic terms.
Right.
Because it seems to me like, and like as you know, we asked you this question once directly, like, do we just abandon cinema with the black body in it, acting out or embodying things like we do in life, and just go straight towards a kind of a stream of consciousness, a black stream of consciousness in a sense? And is this tied to, in some way or another, to this whole idea of crisis around certain kinds of national bodies? It seems to me there seems to be some relationship.
Right.
So.
I was hoping to avoid this. But I'm in it. No, Manthia, I just want to go back to this question of Sembène again, because he seems, one, because as you know, he is the silent partner in most of what I've done and continue to do. And it's tied, I suppose, in a way, to this question of embodiment that AJ is referring to, and might also point, as I see it, towards a way of coming at this question of narrative. See, I mean, for me, the promise of Sembène was always a post-national one.
Right.
And yet the delivery of that post-national premise is a troubling one, and I think it was for him as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Here you are, you're a so-called father of African cinema, and you take that literally. So you're making something which is not bound by your place, as it were.
Right.
At the same time, you know that you have to be cognizant of the local.
Right.
And that push and pull seemed to me to define his practice pretty much all his life, really. And part of it for me has to do with this question of embodiment, because it seems to me that one of the things Sembène realized, both as a precondition for his cinema, but a precondition for African cinema in general, is that we're coming to something which is itself a repository of all sorts of things. And so when you come to that crossroad, the question of whether you choose a narrative, non-narrative, or are also historically specific. You know, if you're an African who grew up in Africa in the 20s or 30s and 40s and 50s, you would have encountered a certain kind of cinema.
Right.
Right. Or a certain embodiment of cinema.
Yeah.
And if you had disagreements with it, whether it's documentary, fiction, narrative, non-narrative, because a lot of the stuff offered to you as education was non-narrative.
Right.
I mean, a lot of the educational stuff was resolutely anti-narrative.
Right.
Then it's possible for you to say, well, I'm going to be agnostic about this question of whether narrative or non-narrative. Can I just ask that question on the basis of where I'm standing? Like, what is good for me?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
What is of value at this precise conjunction? And when you look at Black Girl, for instance, it is a kind of coming together of both fictional and non-fictional elements. You know, half of it's largely documentary.
Right.
I mean, it's, you know, but it's also the coming together of narrative and non-narrative elements.
Exactly.
And it seems to me that he's only able to arrive at this thing because of the awareness of the specific historical impediments to coming constructing images. You know what I mean? Like, okay, I'm going to confront this question of the status of the image right now. And in confronting that, I need to do it both in quote-unquote fiction as well as non-fiction forms. And that's why, for me, is important. But, I mean, it seems to me that part of what is the... Sorry to go on, but
no,
there will be a question. Part of what seems also central to the Sembenian project is, you know, implied in the notion of a cinematic migration. And that's one of the reasons I'm so interested in this session, not because they're talking about, you guys are talking about me at all, I'd rather you weren't, but I'm interested in the ways in which what we call cinema itself is an embodiment of these migratory patterns. I mean, you know, like we talk about early cinema being an amalgam of all sorts of insights from other spaces outside of the cinema. But that continues to be the case. You know what I mean? Like you watch Gravity or something, I don't know. A lot of the impulses are not cinematic ones at all. In fact, quite a few of them are from other spaces. And so it seems to me that this question of embodiment that AJ is raising is the raison d'etre, not just for the practice, but for the project of cinema. I mean, you know, at any one time, it embodies all sorts of things, which one has to decide whether you're going to go along with those or to stand in some opposition to. That's, for me, is a critical thing. What was my question? I've forgotten.
Now we're talking about nationalism.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing. It's a little bit like our thing about digital and the photochemical, you know. And Boardman says, be careful what you wish for, because you might not like it when it comes. I mean, I am just as torn by this question as you are. But it seems to me that if you say you're a Pan-African artist, then that necessarily places you in some Sembenian universe in which the question of the national and the post-national will always be a tension. You know what I mean? Like, you know, one of the things people couldn't understand about Nkrumah, going back to Testament, is, you know, or one of the critiques when he fell was, oh, he took all our money and spent on all these other Africans. You know, and for him, the two were never separate. They were never exclusive. In other words, the condition of becoming for the national was also the basis for its transcendence, because you were interested in that broader question of continental liberty. You know? So yeah, it continues to be a problem.
I'm troubled by it, but you know, It's I see the question of embodiment. It's not what's troubling me. What troubles me is how the artist confronts it. I think you use that word. You know, consciously because I mean, when Abdrahman reached that point in Bamako, he just left the camera. And it seems to me that was it was great because suddenly the film became what it is in many ways. So it's how you to be fair to AJ's point, I think if you bring in Gleason wanted poetry to be reintroduced to the Republic after poetry had been expelled by Plato. He thinks that poetry needs to be used as a tool for philosophizing, as a tool for poetry, of course, but also as a tool for discourse. So we need to reintroduce poetry in the Republic. So if we take poetry to mean what AJ is saying, the relation between prose and poetry, poetics and so on, I don't have a problem with that, but I think that tool have. You said this, AJ said it, I'm just going to repeat it, but it will still have the problem of prior narratives. How do you create this image that Godard talks about, the right image? The just image, he said, l'image juste. I don't even know how to translate it. How do you create that image? And can you even, is there such a thing as what the French people call l'œil vert, the green eye? An eye that has not been contaminated. You see, theoretically, these are the issues. When we talk about embodiment, we have to deal with that. How do you, especially if you say embodiment in cinema and in narrative, but if you say of the black body, if you say that, then theoretically you are in trouble, really. This is what I'm trying to say. You are in trouble because at least most of the progressive blacks, whether it is Richard Wright or Frantz Fanon, they want to see this black embodiment produced through your forms of liberating yourself, through your forms of taking over your own identity, and so on. But they don't see it as something fixed. And, I mean, Richard Wright ultimately, in that famous essay called The God That Died, the Kostler book, is this individual space that he was looking for. He was looking for a space where, on the one hand, the communist could not define him, and on the other hand, the black community also could not contain him. He wanted to be an individual. I mean, this is what he says in that essay. If you look at Fanon, he always said, God make me my body, the body of a person who always question. They want to be there. Of course, you see this in Samben Ousmane also. So the question of embodiment, I think, is very interesting, but I don't think you can defend it theoretically. That's all I'm saying here. But I even agree with it. But theoretically, you can defend it. Okay, then we come here. Okay.
I could have met you halfway. Thank you. That was such a rich talk, and I'm still working through it. And I'm thinking about both the first question and Renee's questions about, and sort of trying to bring them together and maybe come back to the films a little bit. So for me, the question about a kind of déchéance of nationality and the question of character development are so pertinent to looking at Black Audio's films. Right. And I'm thinking that there must be some way to tease out the differences between Abena's story, or testament, let's say, and the Stuart Hall project, and to think about how we ask this question differently now, rather than in the early 80s.
Before, yes.
Right. So Hansworth Song's Testament and Stuart Hall as three different moments. Do you see a shift? Because one hopes, in a way, there will be.
Right. Now, there is this incredible moment in the Stuart Hall project. You saw the film, right?
No, I haven't seen Stuart Hall.
There is a very moving moment where, he talks about he has at least 5 identities, part Jewish, part Indian, part black, part white, and so on. But ultimately, he said, I don't know if the word is categorized, he sees himself as black. He says that, and then as the film goes on, he reaches a point where he's doing exactly what you said, where we no longer, it's not defeat, but we begin to question all these utopias that we had built, I mean, I'm not part of it, but they had built up to this point. So in many ways, what happened is that when you look at it, this is a cliche, but when you look at right at the time when Sarkozy was asking for re-election, and then you look at David Cameron, Angela Merkel, where they all began to attack multiculturalism. They really reached a point where, and they were winning. They still may win, and I don't know. They reached a point where French people had introduced a legislation to take away your nationality. Mm-hmm. They call it déchéance de l'identité. Your identity has decayed. You don't deserve to be French. So this is a common knowledge. Now, character, I think, I agree with your point. If you look at this in the perspective, in the context of character development also, but also of time passing, mm-hmm. then the only thing I can do, and that's what I try to do here, was to see the ways in which these old films inform this new film, and how this new film informs me about John Akomfrah. How much of himself he has invested in this new film. First of all, by selecting the topics. By selecting the topic, minimal selves, by selecting to talk about decolonization. There are at least 11 or 12 chapters. I don't know how many exactly. So in that sense, I see Akomfrah and Hall in a back and forth conversation. That's what this film is. I use it as a kind of grammar book to read his other films. So it means that it's revisionist in a way. So I do agree with that's why I like your concept about time passing, character development, and so on. Yeah. But I don't know if yeah. Okay, you the boss. You tell us to. Yeah.
Okay, so very last time on this. Because obviously I'm obsessed kind of with this question. So let me pose it one other way.
Okay.
Somebody, or in the course of conversations between myself and associates over the years, we sort of said that if you look at jazz, just to take jazz for example, like jazz is largely, not exclusively, but largely is small ensemble music. Mm-hmm. Trios, quartets, quintets. Of course, there was a period where there was swing music and that was big band, but that was a very narrow period. Largely, it's small ensemble music. Now, it's not small ensemble music because Black musical creators could only envision working with small ensembles. Like they didn't have visions of working with larger symphonic instruments, let's say. But because of socioeconomics, forced the issue. So this is when it comes back to this question that I asked John. It's a kind of potentially tragic dimension of the question. It's like, to what degree is your emphasis on the essay form because you haven't been allowed to explore, to continue your obvious incredible, because that's your first film. Why, you haven't been allowed the space to figure out how to work out some of these ideas in what we would call a more narrative. I don't think narrative is the point. That's why I shifted to embodied, the presence of the Black figure, all these kinds of things. It seems to me that the poetic which is what we would use to typically describe the larger body of your work, is a space in which the body is inherently unstable, which is why I think the poetic's relationship to political entities is always somewhat problematic, because it can't be put to quite the same use value as something where the body is more stable and you can say, stand here and hold this particular play card and do this kind of thing, and we make these sort of political or sociological notions about what black people or black subjects are supposed to do. So I guess I'm still struggling with trying to figure out to what degree we are being engineered by our social circumstances. Are we predisposed to this? Is it something of a predisposition given where we are in time, space, and the historical continuum around these issues of identity?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm struggling with
Right.
it myself.
Did you want to speak, Greg? No, I mean, I'll come at it another way then. Let's see whether we can arrive at. I mean, I think that what the point you're making is really 3 points, and hopefully we'll get to chew the fat on all of them in the next couple of days. The bit that interests me, that I want to sort of engage you in, is to do with the essay form. Now, when you think about the elective affinities that tie a whole number of filmmakers across the planet to this form, it's in fact a very specific variant of it. Like, I mean, I don't know many people working in a Vertovian strain now. You know what I mean? Or Astruc or any of those. I mean, most of the commitments to the essay as a sort of working paradigm for filmmakers is really to do with a distinct post-war version of the essay. And it's a post-war version of the essay, it seems to me, that only like came into being, you know, as things start to ossify, as the left starts to lose, you know, a sense of where it might go, as the object and the project becomes slightly confusing. I mean, like, you know, I can't think of one major essay film director who is on the right. You know, there isn't one. There just isn't one. Now, why is that the case? You know, why is this protean form that we all say it is only of some value and interest to people caught Benjamin Angel of history like in winds that are taking them into places that are both philosophically, politically, and psychically unstable? You know, that seems to me to be a question. I don't know the answer to that, but I know for a fact that that's what's happening. You know, whether you take, you know, I mean, if you look at Evans, for instance, you know, what's interesting is what happens to Evans' cinema pre and post-war. You know, the confidence and the idea that the documentary can assert grand truths is really not there after the war. Now that's interesting for me, because this is a guy who you would have thought, you know, would be like thinking, hey, here comes a new world, here we go, you know, the future's looking bright. He doesn't do that. In fact, the films become more and more reflective, you know, less and less certain, and by the end he ends up making a film about the most intangible. His last film is about the most intangible thing ever. I am interested in the wind, he said. Now, you know, interesting. That both Benjamin and, you know, Evans would be obsessed with the same metaphor of history, the wind. So I don't know, dude. I mean, all I'm saying is that...
That one seems a little obvious to me. It seems like progressive-minded people would have no fear, in addition to just being pushed into the mic. In addition to just being pushed into a certain mode of inquiry, it would seem to me, and maybe this is too simplistic, that progressive-minded people are inherently interested in emancipation and the anarchic, whereas people who are not progressive minded are interested in just the opposite of that. So the form itself, the instability of it would almost work against what they typically would be proposing in terms of some sort of doctrine or whatnot. I don't know if that's too simplified, but
it does. It's beginning to at least clear the field that we're talking about. You know what I mean? Like, why didn't we go into making television dramas? You know, why didn't we pursue, you know, the traditional route of cinema? Why this interest in this hybrid protean form called the essay film, which then, you know, mutates into all sorts of other forms of inquiry as we went along. All I can say is that something about the form that appealed to me seemed to also be a kind of post-war preoccupation, that this was a kind of default for a whole number of people for whom the question of the moment was both a question, literally a question, as well as the object of investigation, like where the fuck are we standing right now, seemed more important than the certainty of where we were, you know. That was, like, you can't have a crisis, political or otherwise, which is at the same time a crisis of narrative. And I think, you know, sometimes the awareness of crisis itself, because in a sense that's what crises are. They're crises of you know, breakdowns of storytelling approaches. When you arrive at those moments and you're both politically and psychologically invested in, aware that you're living one of these interregnums, or what Gramsci called the interregnum, then the questioning form becomes attractive. Question is, when do you come out of questioning? You know? I don't know.
Hey, so I wanted, in listening to this conversation, I wanted to address a number of things. Some of these are things that I've heard or been in conversation with AJ and John and other people for, at this point, I'd probably say 25 years. You know, but the first thing would be just the real specific dissatisfaction of people I would define or characterize as kind of black cosmopolitan intellectual filmmakers, with black productivity in, you know, your chosen medium. And Manthia's talked about, you know, a certain kind of crisis, a critical investigation or interrogation of the image, representation. AJ talked about the problematic of economics with respect to the poetic, the gestural. And so I want to think about that, but think about it also in relationship to all of these other areas of what we could call black expressive, black art aesthetic kind of culture, whether it's theater, film, visual arts, because you guys' specific dissatisfaction with what's been produced and with these economic factors is very singular relative to what people have accomplished in other mediums, and not just music at this point. But AJ and I we were talking about this narrative issue a few months ago, and it was something, you know, I think we were both kind of simultaneously obsessed with aspects of it, but one of the realizations that I had, it had to do with the capacity of a certain kind of black performance to hold and actually assemble an audience in the kind of numbers that are equivalent to what blockbusters do, but they would be performances that were solos. So I could think of, you know, in comedy, I could think of Eddie Murphy, Richard Pryor, Chris Rock, who at their heights, you know, could all sell out Madison Square Garden for a week, you know, and which leads you to think about, with respect to those three figures, about how narrative cinema has to perform this kind of reductive containment, almost this kind of disintegration of the very things that allowed them to bring so much energy to the solo performance stage. But I was also, in terms of what you guys were talking about earlier about embodying a national ethos in a form. So I think about somebody like August Wilson, who literally at the beginning of his career had some real specific missions, you know, that had to do with, he was going to write black drama into the classic American canon. He was going to provide work for the next 10 generations of black actors, you know, and inside of that work, as anyone who's seen those things perform can attest, there are forces conjured inside these, you know, these real specific kind of black living room spaces that clearly get at a host of complexities around what we would identify as African American culture and expressivity, you know, and human, you know, the vagaries of human character, personality, emotion, and all those kinds of things. And I'm just curious because in the person of you three, you know, we certainly have, three at this point, fairly historic avatars, you know. I mean, not just on the production side, but of the critical conversation, you know what I mean? So, I won't even, you know, kind of blow the smoke in terms of your own work. We can take that out of it, but in terms of the conversation about the thing, yeah, the richest that I've heard over the past 20 years or so certainly involves the three of you guys. So I'm just, and I don't know that, you know, we've ever been in a room and kind of really, I think we've kind of stabbed at it, you know, in different kind of, you know, dyadic, triadic, quadratic ensembles. But, you know, it seems that there's this dissatisfaction issue. It may be the medium, it may be economics, it may be relative to the feature. Because certainly the conversation about a national cinema is still viable everywhere there's a national cinematic industry, you know. So maybe, you know, there's something to be said there. And, you know, when you talk about these nations not being viable, that is indeed one of the ways in which we would identify it. And that extends to just productivity, you know, across the, you know, I mean, one of the things that I actually do is look at the trade imbalance between, you know, various African nations in the West. So, you know, you look at the GDP of GNP of certain nations, and you see that $64 million, you know, as Africa is spent on just, you know, slippers, you know what I mean, or flip-flops, you know what I mean. So, you know, but clearly though, there's these ways in which the culture itself has found ways. You know, I mentioned a comedian, Stevie Wonder is also somebody I thought about. You know, so it's a question. You know, it's a question of like what is what is actually inhibiting a certain kind of a kind of development within the context of limited means that exists as well in the culture, elsewhere in the culture, that hasn't happened in cinema yet. So.
Yeah, I know you're looking at me for the time. Okay. You bad. She's bad. But, you know, I think this is, Greg put it very succinctly, because he's looking at a dimension that we had not looked at. Because what I hear John and AJ say is the radicality of certain film language, in this case, the SF film. And I will support that. I mean, you know, if you look at the history in France, all the banned films were SF films. You know, wherever you look at Afrique 50, if you look at Les Statues Meurent also, but there were other films. You know, every time an SF film began to address certain issues, French people simply banned it. And, you have a collection of films, a list of films. So I see your point there in pointing out radicalism in the SF form. Also, I would like to broaden that definition of the SF form to include films that also have poetry on the voiceover. You know, poetry soundtrack in many ways, as opposed to, and I think the point about dialectics in John Akomfrah is interesting, because how do you write an essay if you don't do thesis, antithesis in some ways? how you manage that? But I really think that the dimension that had just been added is the dimension, is the question of reception. It's really the crucial question of reception, and how reception really sometimes defines the politics. Because why is Nollywood today anything at all? When Greg was talking, I was thinking about Nollywood and how Nollywood has begun to actually define politics and a kind of social imaginary in Africa. You know, it's not very far in that sense from August Wilson point. So when we look at this question of reception, so you have the question of production. You know, do we do narrative films or SF films? But we also, Greg is saying that's overdetermined by the economic question. And at the economic question, only reception can solve the problem. If you can get people to watch this film, then it doesn't matter whether it is narrative or essay. I think some of that is being said here. If the essay films could, and more, I think that's probably why you have a cable television, that the essay film could construct more and more an audience. But I really think, theoretically, if you just analyze one area of this, and what AJ does by comparing it to music, that's also a very problematic area for me. That to look at the quality of black arts, measure it with music or the African mask. Senghor used to do this. You know, it has to be as good and as abstract as the African mask or a piece of jazz. You know, I really don't think that stands anymore. You know, first of all, black people are not the people listening to jazz that much. So there is that, but also the mediums are independent and autonomous, I know, relative autonomy, but enough that music does not inform quality in black literature or black cinema anymore. And many of the filmmakers don't even know jazz. They you know, at least in the case of Africa, they know rhythm and blues more than they know jazz. They know Afrobeat more than they know jazz. So if you take jazz as this allegory of black excellence, and then take the black art pieces and measure them to that, I think you would be most likely right when you look at Fanon's writing. Baldwin write essays like a jazz musician. He's so good. But when you come to the contemporary, I wonder how that metaphor will last. I really.
Well, let me say this, because the reason I really wanted to expand the conversation outside of the music is because we kind of beat black cinema upside the head with that repeatedly in the in the 80s and 90s, and it's not going away. I mean, the bruises are still there and lumping up, but earlier you guys were talking about this whole question of embodying the thing versus evoking the thing. I think about Toni Morrison. Somebody asked her once, do you think the people you write about read your books? And she said, no, but I do believe that if they read them, they would recognize themselves in them. And I was, I just started rereading her first novel, The Bluest Eye, and there's just, literally in the first 3 pages, there's a line where she talks about the protagonist being impregnated by her father and how the other 2 sisters can't get anything to grow in their garden, and and there's a reference to kind of judgment from God that would keep anything going in their growing in their black plots in the same way that her daddy's seeds were not going to grow in his black plot, right? So that's a invocation and a use of the vernacular, right? Within, kind of the rarefied global knowledge, language of the novel, and there's just so many places elsewhere in the culture where you can say, you could just point to across mediums, you don't have this dissatisfaction with what people have done, and the vernacular is rich enough to contain these kind of national ethos expectations and engage in a communication that, I'm just saying that I think there's just something very specific to what you guys, and I don't just mean you guys in this room, but again, black cosmopolitan intellectual filmmakers, we guys, want the thing to do that. There's definitely an acknowledgement of, and it's relative to questions of legitimacy, that in terms of a cinematic career that have to do with the feature. One of the things AJ and I have actually argued about relative to his own work is around this question of him not having produced a feature, and then me saying, but you've got, 10 things that I would say represent a cinematic practice, that are as rich, and definitely expand our notion of what a black cinema is in a total sense. So, and I guess because he and some of the, other filmmakers that I know are not ready yet to give up on the possibility of their own narrative film desires. It's still in play. It's just still in play. That's all.
No, I agree. I make the last word because again, maybe Greg is becoming wiser than the rest of us. I don't know why. That's scary.
I'm not a filmmaker.
But AJ, John Akomfrah, but Greg also, Renee here. In many ways, I'm an academic, but I don't think I could have thought about any of these ideas without my interaction, becoming in relation with you guys, really. So if I seem to disagree, it is perverse, and I enjoy it because in many ways, that's how I find my voice, So, but I know exactly where you're coming from, and it teaches me a lot, to tell you the truth. AJ, in this case, I know where you're coming from, but at this point, I have no choice but to resist it. It's a kind of perversion, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. Well, No, no. As my last addendum would just be, this is in no way a critique of you guys' productivity, because I don't see it as being impoverished at all.
Look, two things, just really two things.
Okay.
One, I mean, I just use jazz in the instance because Miles Davison's figured it. I don't think jazz is whatever. I don't, honestly,
Right.
I don't listen to much jazz that was produced after 1975, truth be told.
Right.
I mean, I do occasionally, but not generally. It's really more black music
Right. Okay.
as a model.
Okay.
The other thing I say, I'm just not prepared to acquiesce the space that 12 years a slave occupies to that kind of, wrong-headedness or just outright ignorance. It just seems to me to just allow that to just operate in that space with no sort of counter manifestations just seems to be the very definition of being apolitical on a certain
But he can
level.
dismiss narrative because you don't like 12 years a slave.
No, I'm saying, but by us just saying we're going to stay in our lane and operate in the space of the essay film, we are de facto doing that. Because I think 12 Years a Slave, and we can have this conversation at some point, but I think it kind of fails a little bit because it's not complicated enough. It doesn't complicate the challenge of what it's trying to do enough. But I just, but there's nothing else to point to. There's no counter narrative films.
I said earlier that I agree that it's not problematizing the image. But having said that, it's a compelling story. It's really a compelling story. I got bored.
Story, but a lunkheaded treatment
bored.
of that story.
I was tired. I was exhausted. But it's a compelling story. Okay. Okay, thank you. Merci. Thank you, Ali.
So anyway, in brief, thank you everybody for being here. There's some reception outside. Also, tomorrow we're going to start again at 10 o'clock in the morning. And there's going to be coffee, I believe, at 9 or 9:30. So we'll have a full day tomorrow. There's also going to be a screening of the work that was produced during the workshop here tomorrow afternoon. I hope you're all going to be able to be present or tell your friends. Thank you for being here. Good night.